The Council of Varric had been broadcasting executions for 300 years. Oh, do not look so horrified. It was perfectly normal by galactic standards. At least, that is what they told themselves every single rotation cycle as they settled into their observation chairs, poured their fermented nutrient broth, and tuned in to watch some lesser species squirm. It was entertainment. It was politics. It was a message. It was, as it turned out, the single greatest mistake any civilization in recorded history had ever made. My name is Solvin Quor, and I am a historian. I am also, depending on who you ask, either the luckiest or the most cursed individual to have ever survived this particular chapter of galactic events. I was there. I saw the broadcast. I saw what came after. And I am writing this account not because anyone asked me to, but because someone has to explain, in plain and honest language, exactly how the Varric Empire managed to sign its own death warrant in front of 4.7 billion simultaneous viewers across 12 star systems. The Varric were not stupid. That is the truly maddening part. They were sophisticated. They were ancient. They had 17 words for the concept of diplomatic leverage, and not a single word for mercy, which in retrospect tells you everything. They had been watching the humans for 40 years before the incident. 40 years of quiet observation, careful cataloging, the occasional abduction for research purposes. They considered humans a curiosity, a biological oddity, a species that had somehow crawled out of the most catastrophically violent planet in the known galaxy, and developed the audacity to build spaceships without ever once stopping to ask whether the universe wanted them out here. The Varric found this amusing. They were going to find it considerably less amusing very soon. Very soon. The broadcast began at what humans would call roughly 2 in the afternoon. Though the Varric used a time system based on the rotational period of their home world, Varric Prime, which was a planet roughly the size of Jupiter's Resentment and twice as cold. The execution chamber of the High Council was an architectural masterpiece. I say that without a shred of admiration. It was designed, purely and deliberately, to make anyone inside it feel small. The ceiling stretched 40 meters upward into darkness. The walls were polished black stone that reflected everything back at you, distorted slightly wrong, like looking at yourself in the surface of still water just before something very large moves underneath it. High Councillor Draven Yoss sat at the head of the tribunal. He was tall, even by Varric standards, with 4 elongated fingers on each hand, and eyes that were solid silver from edge to edge. He had been High Councillor for 60 years. He was, by all accounts, a deeply theatrical individual who considered every public appearance a performance and every execution a keynote speech. The charge, as it had been read 3 times to the packed viewing galleries and 4.7 billion broadcast recipients, was this: unauthorized presence in Varric sovereign space, disruption of a survey operation, and, most damningly, the injuring of 2 Varric military officers during attempted apprehension. The prisoner was a human child. Her name, which none of the Varric had bothered to learn or use, was Mira Odin. She was 11 years old. She had brown hair that had been poorly cut, probably by herself, and a small scar above her left eyebrow from falling off something she had been specifically told not to climb. She was wearing a cargo suit 2 sizes too large for her, the kind you buy for a child you expect to grow into. Her eyes were brown and very steady. She had been part of a small civilian science crew, a family expedition technically, that had lost navigational control after an ion storm and drifted across a disputed border the humans did not know was disputed because the Varric had marked it with a frequency band humans could not naturally perceive. The survey ship had been seized. The adults had been detained separately. Mira, because she had been in the external observation pod at the time of seizure and had kicked and bit 2 soldiers during the capture, had been elevated from detainee to accused. The Varric legal system did not have an age of culpability. Another one of those details that tells you everything. Draven Yoss let the silence stretch before he spoke. He was good at silence. He used it like a weapon. Creature designated human female, subclassification juvenile, he said, in the flat ceremonial voice that Varric officials used for proceedings. You have been found in violation of the Sovereign Boundary Decree of the 3rd Expansion, the Physical Resistance Statute, and the Secondary Obstruction Code. The tribunal has deliberated. Mira Odin stood very still, a guard on either side of her, chains on her wrists that were frankly enormous relative to her size and looked almost absurd, the way putting a deadbolt on a cardboard box looks absurd. Do you have final words? Draven Yoss asked. This was the theatrical part of the process. No one ever had final words that mattered. It was purely for the broadcast. Mira looked up at him. Just looked, for a long moment. Then she said, with the specific and terrible calm of a child who has been frightened so thoroughly that they have passed through fear entirely and come out the other side. My dad is going to be really upset. The gallery audience, 400 Varric dignitaries and officials and invited observers from 6 allied species, made a sound somewhere between amusement and contempt. Dravan Yas smiled. This was a mistake. Your parental unit has no jurisdiction here, creature. I know, Mira said. I am just saying. The sentence was pronounced. The execution was to proceed. What happened next is the part of this account that historians debate, not because there is any uncertainty about the facts, but because no one can quite agree on which moment was the actual turning point. Some say it was when the broadcast reached the UHS Morrigan, a human military vessel that had been in the sector conducting a navigation survey 3 light hours away, and its captain, a man named Petra Volk, watched 30 seconds of the feed before he began issuing orders in a voice that his crew later described as very, very quiet, which apparently for Petra Volk was significantly more alarming than shouting. Some say it was when the Terran Emergency Network picked up the broadcast and it went public, spreading through human communication channels in approximately 40 minutes, which is the amount of time it takes a small fire to become a large fire if the fire is angry and has been storing grievances. Some say the real turning point was 17 minutes into the broadcast, when Mira Odin, standing in the execution chamber, looked directly into the primary broadcast camera, not at Dravan Yas, not at the gallery, but at the camera, with the intuitive understanding that a child raised in the age of media has for where the real audience is, and said, in perfectly clear standard galactic, somebody is going to come for you. She said it the way you say a thing you are absolutely certain of. Not a threat, not a plea, a statement of fact. The same way you would say the sun is going to rise, or water is going to flow downhill, or an action is going to produce a consequence. The Varric gallery laughed again. They had not yet received the transmission from their border monitoring stations. I was on Varric Prime when the first reports arrived. I was there as a cultural observer from the Neutral Academic Assembly, which is a polite way of saying I was a historian with a press badge and a deep anxiety disorder that I had, up until this point, considered an overreaction to ordinary academic stress. The reports came in scrambled, the way military communications come in when the people sending them are trying to compress urgency into protocol. The border monitoring station at Sector 7 Gamma had detected an incoming fleet signature. Not a single vessel, not a patrol group, a fleet. The communications officer who first decoded the full report later told me she read the numbers 3 times before she said anything to anyone, because the numbers did not make sense, and she was a professional who did not like to cause alarm without verification. She verified. She caused alarm. 37 human warships had crossed into Varric space at maximum velocity, and based on their approach vector they had been moving before the broadcast had even reached its conclusion, which meant the Terran Admiralty had not waited for diplomacy, had not sent a message demanding explanation, had not convened a committee. They had simply turned their ships around and come. Dravan Yas received the military report 14 minutes after pronouncing sentence. The execution had not yet been carried out. There had been procedural delays, as there always were, because the Varric legal system had 17 stages of formal ceremony between sentencing and execution, and they had only completed 9 of them. I was watching his face when his personal aide handed him the data tablet. I watched him read it. I watched his silver eyes move across the information. I watched the exact moment when the smile, that theatrical, practiced, 60-year-old smile, stopped working. How long, he said very quietly, until they reach orbital range. At current velocity, High Counselor, his aide said equally quietly, 4 hours and 20 minutes. Dravan Yas looked at the broadcast camera. Then he looked at Mira Odin. Then he looked at the broadcast camera again. The child was looking at him with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who has already said everything they needed to say and is simply waiting for the universe to catch up. Somebody is going to come for you, she had said. They were already coming. They had been coming before anyone asked them to, before any official channel had even processed the signal, because the signal had reached the right eyes and the right ears, and something in the human species, something old and unreasonable and completely immune to political calculation, had simply activated. I closed my notebook. I looked at the chamber around me, at the black polished walls and the 40-meter ceiling, and the 400 dignitaries who were all, slowly beginning to understand that the entertainment had stopped being entertainment approximately 14 minutes ago. The Varric had ruled this sector of space for 3 centuries. They had never, in 3 centuries, killed a human child on live broadcast. They had also never, in 3 centuries, given the humans a reason. Outside the chamber windows on the monitors, On every broadcast screen across 12 star systems, the stars were still quiet, patient. 4 hours and 19 minutes. 4 hours and 19 minutes. That was how long the Varric had. Dravan Yoss spent the first 8 minutes of those 4 hours and 19 minutes doing what powerful individuals always do when the universe stops cooperating with their plans. He held meetings, he convened advisors, he sent strongly worded transmissions through diplomatic channels. He used his indoor voice, which, for a man who had spent 60 years being the most important person in every room he entered, was still impressively loud. None of it mattered. Not even slightly. I, Solvin Kaur, historian, cultural observer, and increasingly terrified bystander, watched all of it from a corner of the High Council antechamber. I had not left. My press credentials technically entitled me to be there, and some stubborn professional instinct had overridden my survival instinct, which my therapist, had I possessed one, would have found extremely concerning. What I witnessed in those 4 hours was not a military confrontation. Not yet. What I witnessed was something rarer, and from a historian's perspective far more valuable. I watched an empire realize, in real time, that it had made a category error. The Varric had a classification system for species. Most advanced civilizations do, though they rarely admit it. You organize the universe into things that matter, and things that do not, things that require caution, and things that can be managed, and you sleep better at night for having done so. Humans had been classified as a Category 3 species, technologically emerging, biologically resilient, politically fragmented, moderate threat potential. The moderate was the important word. It meant the Varric took humans seriously enough to monitor them, but not seriously enough to be afraid of them. The Category 3 classification had been assigned 40 years ago, based on a thorough and professional assessment conducted by the Varric Intelligence Directorate. The assessment had been accurate, thorough, and spectacularly wrong in the way that only a thorough and accurate assessment can be, when it measures every variable except the one that actually matters. The Varric had measured human technology, they had measured human population, they had measured human military capacity, economic output, territorial reach, and political coherence. They had not measured what humans do when someone hurts a child. Admiral Petra Volk of the UHS Morrigan was 53 years old. He had a face that looked like someone had started carving it out of granite and then lost interest halfway through. He had 31 years of service, 2 commendations for valor, 1 formal reprimand for unauthorized engagement with a pirate convoy that had technically been outside his jurisdiction, and a reputation among his crew as a man who communicated primarily in silences of varying severity. His communications officer, a young woman named Dasa Fien, had been the one to intercept the Varric broadcast. She had patched it to the bridge. She had watched the Admiral watch it. She later described the experience as, like watching a very old mountain decide to become a volcano. Volk had watched exactly 30 seconds of the broadcast. Then he had turned to his navigation officer and said, in that very quiet voice, plot a course into Varric space, maximum sustainable velocity, Admiral. His executive officer, a man named Ral Sunto, had said carefully, we are a single patrol vessel. Standing orders require we contact command before any incursion into contest. I am contacting command right now, Volk said, while we move. The transmission Volk sent to Terran Admiralty Command lasted 90 seconds. It contained the broadcast footage, their current position, his intended course, and 11 words of personal commentary, which was 9 more words of personal commentary than Volk's typically offered. The 11 words were, they are going to execute a child. I am going. Terran Admiralty Command received the transmission, reviewed the broadcast footage, and convened an emergency session that lasted 6 minutes, which, for a governing body that had once spent 4 months debating the exact wording of a trade agreement, was essentially instantaneous. They did not order Volk to stand down. They did not send a diplomatic inquiry to the Varric High Council. They did not consult the Neutral Academic Assembly or the Galactic Convention on Sovereign Jurisdiction or any of the 17 other committees that theoretically existed to handle exactly this kind of situation. They sent 36 additional warships after Volki. The authorization order, which I later obtained for my records, contained a great deal of formal military language about rules of engagement and jurisdictional frameworks. The handwritten note from Admiral General Yusa Toom at the bottom, added after the formal language, said simply, bring her home. Back on Varric Prime, the emergency session of the High Council had reached the shouting stage. This was progress, in a way. The first 8 minutes had been denial. The next 20 had been bargaining dressed up as strategy. The shouting stage meant they had arrived at something resembling honesty, which is what happens to people when 4 hours becomes 3 hours becomes 2 hours, and the stars outside are not moving except in entirely the wrong direction. Counselor Drev Matan, who oversaw military affairs and had the specific exhausted look of a man who had been saying something important for years without being listened to, slapped a data tablet onto the council table hard enough that 2 water vessels fell over. "I have been telling this body for 8 years, he said, without any theatrical decoration whatsoever, that the human threat assessment was wrong. I submitted 4 reports. I used charts. I used historical comparisons. I used the phrase catastrophic underestimation in the title of one of them, because I thought that might attract attention. The assessment was conducted by qualified professionals," Dravanyos said from his seat at the head of the table. He said it the way you say something you no longer believe but cannot yet afford to stop saying. "The assessment measured what humans could do," Drev Mata said. "It did not measure what humans would do. Those are not the same thing." He pulled up the incoming fleet data on the central display. 37 signatures, moving at a velocity that suggested the pilots had decided fuel efficiency was a concern for a different day. These ships were not scrambled. They were not assembled. They were redirected. Half of them were already in the sector on routine operations. The other half crossed 2 territorial boundaries in under 3 hours. Our own fastest mobilization response time, tested and recorded, is 9 hours. Theirs apparently is however long it takes someone to watch a broadcast and turn a ship around. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Not the theatrical quiet of Dravanyos, the other kind. The kind that settles on a room when everyone in it is processing the same unpleasant information at slightly different speeds. "What do they want?" one of the younger counselors asked. She sounded genuinely uncertain, which was not an expression you heard often in high council chambers. Drev Matan looked at her. Then he looked at the display. Then he said, with the particular tone of a man delivering a diagnosis no one is going to enjoy, "They want the child. They want her alive. And based on the approach vector, they are not coming to the negotiating table. They are coming to the execution chamber. I need to stop here and tell you something about the Varric that you need to understand because otherwise the next part of this account will not make sense. The Varric were not cowards. Do not make that mistake. They were ancient, they were organized, and they were militarily formidable. They had won wars. They had held an empire across 12 star systems for 300 years through a combination of genuine power and the carefully maintained appearance of absolute invincibility, because an empire that appears undefeatable rarely has to prove it. That appearance was the empire. Crack the appearance, and you crack the foundation. They knew this. Every decision they had made for 3 centuries had been structured around protecting that appearance. You do not show weakness. You do not retreat. You do not yield to the demands of a Category 3 species that had, 3 hours ago, been a curiosity. The problem, the absolute and catastrophic problem, was that 37 warships were now 1 hour and 40 minutes from orbital range, and the human vessels were not slowing down, and every signal intelligence analyst the Varric had told them the same thing. The humans were not bluffing. Dravanyos knew what bluffing looked like. He had been doing it for 60 years. He knew the tells, the slight overcommunication, the delay between provocation and response that says the response is being carefully constructed for an audience, the escalation that always stopped just short of the point where it became costly. None of those tells were present. The humans had not sent an ultimatum, had not made a list of demands, had not given the Varric a graceful off-ramp that both sides could use to de-escalate while technically claiming victory. They had just come. Mira Odin had been moved from the execution chamber to a holding room when the fleet reports started coming in. I found this out later. The guards who moved her reported that she did not ask questions, did not argue, and sat down on the bench in the holding room with the composed patience of a child waiting for a delayed school transport. One of the guards, a young soldier named Voss Trellin, later gave a statement to the neutral academic assembly. He said he had expected the human child to be frightened. He had been somewhat prepared for crying. He had not been remotely prepared for the expression she actually wore, which he described as the look of someone who already knew how this was going to end and was simply being polite about waiting. He said. She asked him, once, whether he had family. He said he told her yes. She nodded. He said, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to sitting quietly. I think about that exchange a great deal. The Varric made their decision at the 1 hour and 2 minute mark. It was not a unanimous decision. I want to be clear about that. Drev Matan had been arguing for the only option that made any strategic sense for the better part of 2 hours, and for the better part of 2 hours he had been losing that argument to the accumulated weight of 3 centuries of imperial pride. Then the fleet signature updated. 3 more vessels had joined the human approach formation. These 3 were not standard warships. The Varric signal intelligence officers identified them in under 4 minutes, because they were a type of vessel the intelligence files described in considerable detail, with a threat assessment flag that was, unlike the general human Category 3 classification, distinctly not moderate. They were designated human deep strike carriers, vessels designed not for fleet engagement but for surface bombardment, for reaching past orbital defenses and delivering ordnance directly to planetary surfaces with a precision that the Varric tactical analysts had reviewed during a wargame exercise 18 months earlier, and subsequently recommended never discussing in any official capacity because the conclusions were deeply uncomfortable. Someone on the Terran Admiralty side had made a decision about what category this situation fell into. Drev Matan did not say "I told you so." He was a professional. He simply placed his hands flat on the council table and said, "We have 47 minutes. What is your answer?" Dravan Yos sat for a long time, long enough that the chamber clocks ticked visibly, long enough that 2 junior counselors shifted in their seats, long enough that the broadcast feed, which had been running on a secondary screen in the corner and which no one had thought to turn off, showed a continuing loop of the execution chamber, empty now, the chains still hanging where a child had stood. Then he said very quietly, "Release her." The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of an empire cracking, not breaking, not yet, just cracking. The way old stone cracks under new pressure, the sound more felt than heard, somewhere deep in the foundation where the weight has always rested. Mira Odin was brought to the primary communications bay at the 31-minute mark. She was given water, which she drank. She was given back her personal communicator, which had been confiscated at detention. She turned it on, looked at the screen, and said nothing. She was told, through a translator, that arrangements were being made for her transfer to the incoming human fleet. She said, "What about my dad?" The translator relayed the question. There was a pause. Then she was told that the surviving members of her ship's crew would be included in the transfer arrangement. She said, "Surviving?" Another pause. Then she was told that 2 members of the crew had not survived the initial seizure, and that she would be provided full details at the appropriate time. She did not cry. Not in front of the guards, not in front of the cameras, not in front of anyone watching on the broadcast that was still, somehow, still running. Because no one at the Varric Media Coordination Office had received a formal order to cut the feed, and no one wanted to make that call themselves. She sat very straight. She held the communicator. She looked at the wall. I watched this on the broadcast feed from the antechamber, and I wrote exactly 1 sentence in my notebook during that moment. I have kept that notebook. The sentence says, "She was 11 years old, and she did not look away." The transfer happened at the 14-minute mark. A Varric diplomatic shuttle carried Mira Odin and 4 surviving crew members to the edge of the Varric defensive perimeter. The human fleet was waiting exactly where they said they would be. No farther in. Exactly there. The shuttle docked with the UHS Morrigan. Admiral Petra Volk met them personally, which was noted in every account I collected afterward because admirals do not typically stand in docking bays. Volk stood in the docking bay. The official record says the transfer was completed without incident. What the official record does not include, because it was captured on a personal recording by one of Volk's crew and passed around human networks for approximately 3 years before anyone thought to archive it officially, was what Volk said when Mira Odin walked off the shuttle. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at her. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No, sir." He nodded. He said, "Your father is on the Kestrel, 2 ships back. We are going to take you there now." She said, "Okay." Then she said, "There were 2 people on our crew who did not make it." "I know," Volk said. "You should know their names," she said. Their names were Sable Oren and Tam Wayrick. They were scientists. Sable studied atmospheric phenomena. Tam was a navigation specialist. They should not be forgotten just because they were not the part of the story everyone was watching. Petra Volk looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "I will make sure they are in every official report." "Thank you," Mira Odin said. Then she walked with him down the corridor and the docking bay cameras caught her from behind, small in the cargo suit that was still 2 sizes too large, and the doors closed. The Varric Empire did not fall that day. I want to be accurate. Empires do not fall in a single afternoon, not even dramatic ones. What happened was something more complicated and, in the long accounting of history, considerably more permanent. They had been seen. The broadcast that had been meant to demonstrate invincibility had transmitted, to 4.7 billion viewers across 12 star systems, a precise and unambiguous picture of what the Varric were, and, far more importantly, a precise and unambiguous picture of what the humans were. The humans were the species that turned 37 warships around in under 3 hours because someone broadcast a child in chains. They were the species from the planet that should not have produced sapient life by any standard galactic metric. The planet with 17 active extinction events running simultaneously. The planet with predators that attacked for sport, weather systems that functioned as weapons, an axial tilt that produced season changes violent enough to require biological adaptation across the entire lifespan, and a tectonic situation that one Varric geological survey had once described as aggressively unstable. The species that had crawled out of that planet and built starships. The species that had no word, in any of their major languages, for an acceptable reason to let a child die alone. The Varric intelligence assessment had measured what humans could do. In the 4 hours and 19 minutes of that afternoon, the galaxy learned what humans would do. The Varric Council spent 6 years rebuilding their diplomatic standing with 3 allied species who quietly began reassessing their own relationship with the Empire after the broadcast. They spent 11 years in closed negotiations with Terran representatives over reparations, boundary agreements, and the formal acknowledgement of 2 scientists named Sable Orun and Tam Wayrick, whose names were inscribed, per treaty requirement, on a monument on Varric Prime that no one was particularly happy about but everyone agreed was necessary. Dravan Yos resigned from the High Counselorship 8 months after the incident. He never gave a public statement explaining his reasoning. He did not need to. Drev Matam was appointed to replace him. His first official act was to commission a new intelligence assessment of the human species. I have read that assessment. The Category 3 classification was retired permanently. The new classification was a single sentence, which I am including here verbatim because I believe it is the most accurate thing the Varric Intelligence Directorate has ever written. It said, "Humans are not a threat to be managed. They are a consequence to be avoided." Mira Odin was reunited with her father, a marine biologist named Kale Odin, on the ship called the Kestrel, approximately 46 minutes after leaving Varric custody. I do not have a recording of that reunion. No one does. The crew of the Kestrel, by unspoken agreement, gave the family the corridor to themselves. I think that is correct. I think some moments do not need to be broadcast. She was returned to her home station 4 days later. She went back to school the following week. She grew up. She became, as a matter of public record, an interspecies relations attorney who spent her career on border dispute cases, which her colleagues found either poetic or predictable depending on their perspective. She gave one interview, once, to a journalist who managed to actually get her to sit down, about the events of that afternoon. She talked for about 20 minutes. The journalist asked her, toward the end, whether she had been afraid, standing in that chamber. She thought about it. Then she said, "Yes, but I knew someone was coming." The journalist asked how she could have been so certain. Mira Odin looked at the camera, not at the journalist, at the camera, the same way she had looked at the camera in the execution chamber, with that same direct and entirely unperformative certainty. She said, "Because that is what we do. I, Solvin Quor, am finishing this account in my study on Arvin Station, 14 years after the events described. My notebook from that day is on the shelf to my left. I have filled 43 notebooks since then. None of them contain a sentence as clear as the one I wrote watching a child hold still in a room full of strangers who meant to kill her. She was 11 years old and she did not look away. The stars outside my window are quiet tonight. I have learned, since that afternoon, to find that specific kind of quiet slightly less comfortable than I used to. It is the quiet before consequence. The humans are still out there, still building ships, still crossing distances that should not be crossable at speeds that should not be sustainable, with expressions on their faces that you only learn to read correctly once you understand what they are from, and what it cost them to get here. I recommend, for the record, and I say this with the full professional weight of 30 years as a galactic historian, that you do not give them a reason. They will come. They were always going to come. And they will not negotiate until the child is safe.